I am the chair, Chris McAllister. I'm having some technical issues with my camera, so please forgive me on that instance. Can we please do roll call for all voting members of the PHB Executive Committee? Diana, would you be willing to read off?
I can start. Brittany Quick-Warner, Vice Chair, Eugene Chamber of Commerce.
Lucy Dennis, Mayor of Eugene.
Matthias Smith, Youth and Young Adult Representative.
Chris McAllister, lived experience, seat, and chair. Are there any other voting members of the Executive Committee, Diana?
I don't see, but let's see, Pat Farr.
Excused.
Oh, excused. And Lori Trieger.
Not present.
And Sean Van Gordon.
Not present.
Okay, that's our executive committee.
So it looks like we have quorum, so we have enough to be able to approve our minutes from the July 21st Executive Committee meeting. And to accept the October statement, financial dashboard, and financials. Are there any motions or questions about those two items?
I'll move to approve both those items.
There's a move. Is there a second?
I'll move to a second, but when we get farther down to the deep dive into financials, I'm hoping we can talk about some of the things reflected there.
Agreed. Noted. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, please signify by saying nay. Hearing none, motion carries. Thank you, everybody. Now we'll move on into the jurisdictional updates. Would Lane County like to speak to some of the updates that they're having, followed by Cottage Grove?
I believe that's me. I see a nod from Karen. Yes, okay. Hi, everyone. Filling in for Kate today, Brianna Rogers, Program Services Coordinator. A couple quick updates. We want to thank everyone who voted for the Coordinated Entry Work Group members. There are 3 new members who were officially voted in by a majority of the PHB members. And then another big thank you to those who applied for the 3 open PHB member seat positions. The applicants are going through interviews this week, and the ad hoc membership committee will be making recommendations to the full PHB in December. And then last update, please consider nominating 1 PHB member for chair and up to 2 PHB members for vice chair by emailing Kate Budd by next Friday, November 25th. It is the day after Thanksgiving. The role descriptions were sent out in the meeting agenda, and the PHB will be asked to vote on chair and vice chairs in December.
Thank you very much, Brianna.
Thank you.
Any questions regarding this update from board members? Excellent. Well, thank you. Councilor Fleck, would you be willing to speak to what's going on in Cottage Grove?
Oh, you bet. Well, and as Chris knows, Carry It Forward is the agency that's running the new low barrier shelter the city of Cottage Grove is sponsoring, which is awesome. I think we're full. If not, we're really, really close. That's presented some challenges because we have more folks in town than even I expected. So our city has some overflow spots for folks who are unable or don't want to be in that low barrier shelter. So the downside of all of that is that we did not have any freezing nights programs planned, and so Beds for Freezing Nights is a local group, and our agency are going to partner together to get those rolling. We're hoping in a week or two we'll be able to be up and running. I wish we would have been planning this 2 months ago, but we just didn't have any clue, of the level of folks that were going to be in our low barrier shelters. So that's kind of it. The last piece of our the city is now excluding folks from the based on there's a criteria for each park. So there's a level 3 park, which won't have any camping in it, a level 2, which would be a last resort if the first tier are full. So I think our city is avoiding any sort of legal ramifications and addressing the issues with our unhoused population. So I think that we've hit a good balance as far as what's in the best needs of the unhoused folks, as well as the folks utilizing our parks. So we'll see. It's, I think, going to be an ongoing discussion, as most cities would attest to. But I think we're making good progress at this point, and I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Councilor Fleck. Is there any other questions regarding Cottage Grove updates? I would like to say that we did have a loss in our community, unfortunately, and a young person took their life this week in Cottage Grove while waiting for some kind of hope. And so the work that we are doing is very, very vital and very, very important, and we must not forget our people. So thank you very much, Councilor. City of Eugene, would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. So the exciting news from the City of Eugene is that the municipal court won a $600,000 3-year grant, which they are using to stand up a shelter that will serve people who come through the community court system. So these are folks who, have gone through the community court, have some form of restitution that they need to do, community service hours, whatever. And we're providing them with a stable shelter will really enable them to fulfill those commitments and hopefully get back on their feet. So it's very exciting. They're looking for sites and looking for a provider, so that's all in motion right now, and there's no news to report on that exactly, except that it's in motion, and I think it's going to be an incredible new resource for folks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mayor Van Gordon, Springfield update?
Yeah, I apologize for being late. The big thing Springfield had is that went on the last month is we approved, working through our economic development agency. The memorial building is the Egan site for the year. Well, I guess for the season. So that's something we've done the last couple of years. It's been a site that works very well for that we've, it's always sort of been a little bit up in the air, but to try to find a long term, we want to try to find a more permanent location for Egan, but that at least gives us a place, a site, as we've definitely been into the freezing season the last couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Mayor Van Gordon. Are there any questions for the mayors of Eugene or Springfield? Not seeing any. Brittany, would you be happy to share about the work groups?
The work groups. Workforce development. Yes. So if you guys remember, a couple months ago, the county had to pause the workforce development subcommittee of the Poverty and Homelessness Board to really give staff the capacity to lean into a couple of the NOFOs that they were responding to. And the chamber had a group of employers that had started convening around the workforce development. And so greatly willing to combine those two groups, so that those committees have still been meeting, and a whole lot of employers now sitting around that table as well. We got a grant from Lane Workforce Partnership to move forward, and we're holding on to hope for another grant from the Lane Community Council to move forward a couple workforce pilots in the hopefully early months of next year. So we've been working with shelter providers and employers to identify barriers on both sides of the spectrum, barriers for unhoused individuals into getting and keeping work, and then barriers on the employer side to training and supporting those individuals. And we have a couple pilot programs where we're honing in on this concept of transitional work opportunities. So jobs that allow 2 to 3 hours of work a week, 2 to 3 days a week, to really offer opportunities for unhoused individuals who rightly so are recovering from an enormous amount of trauma from living on the street. So we'll see. I'm hopeful that there's going to be a couple cool pilot projects that can then hopefully scale pretty easily.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brittany. Are there any questions for Brittany? Okay,
Sorry, Chris, can I add also, not on the workforce side of it, but we are hearing loud and clear this plea from Eakin Warming Center for locations and volunteers. And there's a group within the business community who's trying to heed that plea and get the word out. And we've been doing a lot of communicating and one-on-one reaching out to businesses and just different places that we're trying to get creative that might be able to open up their doors for either location or volunteer. So that need is being heard within the business community, and folks are really sympathetic and trying to figure out if there's any way we can help answer that call.
Thank you so much, Brittany. And as one of the leads in Springfield Egan and a supporter of the Cottage Grove Freezing Nights, I certainly echo that call. This is a county-wide need, and winter is here. So thank you, everybody, for who's participating and for the communities who've helped make things happen. Whoops, apparently I hit the wrong button. Thank you, Brittany, for that. Before we jump into the next item, I open committee members or staff to give any other jurisdictional or community updates that would be relevant. Is there anything happening in Oak Ridge or in the unaffiliated areas? Anything else we need to know before we move on to Amanda Borda's section?
Chris, this is Dr. Foster. We do have a warming center out in Bonita that has been opening up, and I'm not sure the numbers there, but it seems to be working well. And we continue to have an active group out there that's working on homeless issues that involves a number of volunteers, and the city's quite involved as well.
So, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Foster. And I do understand that there is some expansion of some outreach services for our Lane County folks, and so maybe we can get an update on that next meeting. But now I'd like to invite Amanda Borda to talk about the UFA, the Unified Funding Agency.
Thanks, Chris. I see Diana maybe is putting that up. Great, thank you. Could you zoom in a little bit, Diana? It's a bit small on my screen. Thanks. All right. So my name is Amanda Borda. I'm a Senior Program Services Coordinator with Lane County, and I work with our Continuum of Care. Most of you know me, but I see some guests in the room. So we talked a little bit briefly at the last all-member meeting. Sort of this topic of the Unified Funding Agency came up inadvertently, and today I wanted to bring to the Executive Committee just a quick sort of overview of what that is, in hopes that maybe we can be prepared to bring that to the full PHB and understand after today sort of what major questions we have that I can make sure I answer before we bring this to the big PHB group, and other things that sort of we at Lane County should be thinking about in terms of this topic. So I'll just go over really briefly what the Unified Funding Agency means and what it is and what it could do for our community. So essentially it's a designation from HUD under the Continuum of Care, which allows the collaborative applicant, which is what we are now. We apply for our COC funding as a collaborative for our community. It allows us to essentially receive and distribute funding as a single entity under a single grant agreement. Currently, all of our projects are funded individually. So we apply for them as a group. We submit that to HUD as a bundle. But when we get those grant agreements, each project has its own grant agreement. So it's not one. And then we also have our co-applicants, Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul, who receive their grants directly. So those grants don't currently go through Lane County, although the rest of our projects do currently. So what that does is it's a designation from HUD that essentially provides us with additional sort of autonomy to make decisions, especially around funding and sort of moving funding from project to project, and provides kind of removes a layer and puts more of the onus on the COC to monitor those grants, make decisions around funding, and allows us to have a little more flexibility around things that we would typically have to go to HUD in order to do. So some of the benefits that are included in that, the collaborative applicant would gain the ability to move funds across projects. So currently, the way that works, funds can only be moved, say, from our Mackenzie Rapid Rehousing project to our Sahaley PSH project. The only way we could move funds from one of those to the other would be to do a formal reallocation of funds during the competition, and that would be a permanent decision. So there's no other way to move funds, like, for example, if a project is not able to spend down, if they think we're going to have $10,000 left at the end of the year, that money really has to stay within that project. So there's really limitations around what they could do with it. We can move it categories, but we couldn't move it to a different project that was sort of overspent at that point, for example. Under a UFA, we would have more flexibility to do shifts like that amongst and across projects if those shifts are less than 10%, and we could do that without a formal amendment process. So that alone is a pretty big flexibility. The other thing that it could do is set a single operating start date for our grants. We usually keep our grants to a couple of different start dates, although over the last couple of years, some of them have gotten off that track. And so we have grants that start at various times throughout the year, which provides a lot of administration for us to do and for the projects. And so setting a single operating start date has a lot of benefits to it. The other big thing that I wanted to talk about too is that the match can be provided collectively for the one single grant rather than individual projects. So currently, each project has to provide their own 25% match. And that match must be spent on eligible costs for that specific project. So for the UFA, we would have one single grant and could provide that at the system level, which is kind of a huge benefit for us. We have projects that are able to provide a large amount of match. Some provide over 100% match, while others struggle to meet that 25%. So overall, I took a look at the numbers, and we, are responsible as 25% for providing close to $1 million in match across our COC. What we actually provide, because some provide more and some provide less, we actually provide close to 1.5 million at least in match currently. And that would allow us to really think about that at a system level, how Lane County could potentially sort of do that more strategically and provide that match rather than each individual agency. We don't know what that would look like, of course, but there's a lot of options there, and I think that's very intriguing. The other thing is that we would have access to additional funding to support this work. And I see a question from Brittany. Did you want to ask that now?
I wasn't sure what your plan was. I'm happy to wait.
Oh, whatever works for you.
Let's finish this portion, and then we'll do a Q with Brittany at the beginning.
Okay. So the UFA can access additional funding. It's typically about 3% of our total amount that we receive from HUD. And that funding can support additional fiscal control and accounting and monitoring activities that we are required to do as a UFA. That 3% is similar to like our planning grant, for example. So it would only support activities kind of at the COC level that are related to UFA. But it's about $120,000 estimated that we could receive to support that work too. The last benefit is that we submit annual performance reports annually for each of our projects. So currently we do, between all of the co-applicants and us, we would submit, I think, 13 or 14 APRs every year. But moving to a UFA, since we have one grant agreement, we would submit simply one for each project type. So we would only submit one for PSH, rapid rehousing, and I believe HMIS and planning. So we would only have to do 4 reports per year versus 13 or 14. I want to stop there and talk a little bit about the benefits, and if folks had questions about anything I said there before I move on to the rest, if that's okay.
Yes, ma'am. Brittany?
I think my my question might be more big picture context. So I think I'll wait till the end to make sure that you don't answer it. So I'm lowering my hand. Okay.
My question, second in queue, would be the knowing that there's the ability to move across projects. How does this work when we do specific projects such as DV or youth projects within this umbrella?
Yeah, so we would have to come up with operating guidelines and policies and procedures of how those moves can happen, whether the board is comfortable with the COC simply making those decisions, or if we want to have a process for doing so, or if we want board approval for those things. But under it, there's no sort of restriction, I believe, about moving funds between certain projects. I don't know if planning is separate potentially versus like our actual program grants. That's possible. I don't have that answer, so I can find that out. But as far as moving across sort of different types of projects within that and who they serve, I don't believe there's a restriction on that.
Yes, ma'am. And just a quick follow-up, given that there is more financial oversight and direction oversight, is there more budgeting options to ensure the coverage for that?
I'm not sure.
The increased admin nature, the increased group math, is there more funding either for partners to be able to coordinate with the county oversight or community oversight? And is there more staff time to be able to monitor and support those folks who are doing this extra reporting, extra work?
Yeah, so like I said, we would have access to that additional UFA funding. So that would support potentially additional Lane County staff capacity to provide that monitoring and accounting and fiscal sort of oversight that's required as part of being a UFA. Although I will say that we do the majority of those required tasks already because Lane County holds the majority of our COC grants. So we would just be adding the Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul grants sort of into that portfolio. But we already do a lot of those activities because of the nature of the way our COC is set up already. So we're actually not far from a UFA at this point, and that's why HUD is kind of suggesting it to us as well, because for some COCs, every agency receives their own funds directly across the board. So it's a much bigger change to move all of those under one COC grant versus for us where we already hold the majority. And in terms of additional funding for providers, there's not necessarily additional funding that comes with it for additional programming or for providers, although we could think more strategically about maybe how we move some funds from grants that don't spend as much to others, or think more strategically about match as well.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Just for a quick clarification for the record, my request was because sometimes the coordination with county staff or city staff, or if it's spread across the spectrum, sometimes it makes more calls, more paperwork, more email exchange, finding a place where there's a hot spot to respond, just those types of things. And so knowing that there might be an additional bandwidth issue, just making sure that if we did do something like this, if there was options to offset or compensate the providers who are partnering with the government to do this. So thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, so that's a good segue to some of the, and I say challenges here, but they're not, I won't say that all of them are challenges, but just caveats or things to consider that might come along with it. So there is, right, some additional responsibility that Lane County would have for financial and programmatic monitoring. Although we already started monitoring Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul's grants a few years back. We had sort of dipped our toes in that, and so it's not adding a ton of workload as far as monitoring, and we already have financial and fiscal policies and procedures in place, being a county and overseeing current COC grants, so that we wouldn't have to sort of add additional. It would just be adding a few contracts. Aligning the grant dates, as I mentioned, is a great benefit, although it is an upfront challenge. So that one is a big one. It's not as simple as sort of moving the grant date and saying this is your new start date. There's a specific formula and a way that HUD does that, which presents some upfront challenges in terms of spending and moving those to new years. But it is worthwhile in the long term, so we would just have to be sort of thoughtful about how we do that. Aligning the grant dates, as I mentioned, is a great benefit, although it is an upfront challenge. So that one is a big one. It's not as simple as sort of moving the grant date and saying this is your new start date. There's a specific formula and a way that HUD does that, which presents some upfront challenges in terms of spending and moving those to new years. But it is worthwhile in the long term, so we would just have to be sort of thoughtful about how we do that. And the other last bullet point there is we may need to think about some additional funding in order to equitably provide for administrative costs to co-applicants. Currently, Lane County provides Human Services Commission HSC funding to our Lane County COC subrecipients to sort of offset costs of admin and match. So if we were to add Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul into that portfolio under Lane County, we would, one, retain some of their admin costs that they currently get 100% of, and two, those projects wouldn't have HSC funding that they get for those projects. And so if we wanted to think about that as far as equity, we would maybe need to rethink that amount that we would need to add, or rethink how we put HSC funding into our contracts. And that sort of connects to the match conversation too. So I think there's options there to think about. Questions about any of those before I talk about sort of how we would move forward?
Mayor Mayor Venus, and then Brittany, Vice Chair Cliff Warner.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this. I mean, this just sounds very efficient and very good. So I'm really think it seems like a great idea. I just need a little clarification from you. The UFA would be the county, right? So your co-applicants now, Homes for Good and SVDP, they would not be the UFA.
No.
Okay.
They are currently, so there's currently 3 recipients of Lane County funds. That's Lane County, Homes for Good, and St. Vincent de Paul. And then Lane County has sub-recipients that actually operate our projects. Same for Homes for Good. What it would do is essentially turn Lane County into the recipient for all of those grants. And then we would, so Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul would be most impacted because they would then be now sub-recipients in that scenario.
Right, yeah, thank you. That's what I just wanted to make sure I understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.
That was kind of my question too. I think just like clarifying that Homes for Good and St. Vinny's would now come under the county as okay. My head is spinning with so many thoughts. It's like I got to formulate it into a question before I raise my hand again.
Yeah, and this is just the first conversation we can have about this. I don't want anyone to feel like we're rushing to do this. I'll talk a little bit more about what the process looks like to actually move forward, but happy to understand what the questions are or what I can clarify before we bring it to the full board.
Thank you. And Mayor Van Gordon.
What's the benefit to Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul?
That's a good question. They are the ones most impacted, and I've started having conversations with them about that, especially St. Vincent de Paul, and I have it on my radar to talk with Homes for Good more about how this might impact them. I think in terms of the benefits, it's really around sort of the movement of funds across all projects is really probably the biggest benefit. Right now, again, that can only happen through reallocation. So we would include them then in our Lane County portfolio as a subrecipient. And that potentially means that we could move funds to those projects as well, and not just amongst our own subrecipients. So that could potentially be a benefit. I think there could be a benefit in terms of the match conversation as far as providing that as one single entity as Lane County. Because those projects now have to match individually, and some have struggled to meet that sort of minimum 25% match as an agency. So we could think more strategically about how we do that.
And what's the drawback for them too?
The drawback is that they could, right, they're a recipient now directly with HUD, so they do lose some of that autonomy on their end to make changes to their own grants because they would now be subrecipients under Lane County.
And are they supportive? Are they behind this, or are they still evaluating it?
I think we're still evaluating that. I had an initial conversation with some St. Vincent de Paul staff, and they were supportive of the concept. But I think they still, I'm sort of gathering what their questions are and what their concerns are. So part of us to be able to move forward, we would have to have their sort of firm support that's required by HUD, that all applicants would have to sign on to it essentially and say yes. So I want to resolve any concerns that they might have. But I've also had conversations in the past with Jacob about it, so I think I need to just revisit that with Homes for Good. The benefit is that, the good thing is that we already actually have both of those that we work with for other contracts outside of COC. So having them be contracting with Lane County is not a brand new concept to either of them either.
Thank you, Mayor Van Gordon. Amanda, quick follow-up on that is, does this affect anything that the local jurisdictions are doing, or does it support or supplant anything that they're working on?
Not that I can think of offhand. It's really just a different sort of designation and moving away from being a collaborative applicant to a UFA. So it's just a sort of technical difference under HUD for our COC.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Amanda before she moves on in the document? Or is there anything else that we need to cover on this topic, Amanda?
I'll just wrap up with sort of what the next steps are in terms of what would need to occur.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. So like I said, it does require all support from the current applicants. So Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul would have to sort of sign on and say yes. So we're starting those conversations now and hope to resolve any concerns that they might have. And like I mentioned already, the COC would have to come up with sort of specific UFA operating guidelines and policies and procedures that provide for COC oversight. Because there's this more flexibility, et cetera, the board would really have to approve additional policies that say, here's the decisions that we want the COC to make independently, here's what we want them to bring to us for approval. Different, we can look at different UFAs and what their policies are around that to get examples. But do you want us to be able to, for example, select a new subrecipient without consulting you? Do you want us to be able to make changes to funding across projects without consulting you? Or what decisions do the board want oversight of? So just outlining that in a written document is required. And then making sure Lane County monitoring and fiscal oversight policies are in place. That's something we're required to submit to HUD, but again, we already do that work, so those are sort of taken care of at this point. And then overall, the COC board would have to do a formal vote on this as well. Then on the last page, so HUD does recommend that a sort of work group or subcommittee take a look at this and make sure everything's in place before applying, making sure you have those policies, procedures that you've discussed, benefits and drawbacks. So that's one method that the group can sort of vote to do, or if there's a handful of members who are really interested and want to kind of dive into this with Lane County, just to answer some of those more detailed questions outside of a meeting. That would be our recommendation. And then the way that we actually apply is through the COC registration that happens every year. So that happens in between January and March. It's released the second Tuesday of January and is due the first Thursday of March. And at that point, we would, instead of applying as a collaborative applicant, we would say we want to register as a UFA. And we would submit the sort of required paperwork and supporting documentation, and then we would await HUD's approval of that UFA status. Are there questions about that?
Brittany?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding this right, we will have to have made a vote of this board to move forward prior to the first Thursday of March. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I would say, so it opens up the second Tuesday of January, but is due in March. So somewhere in that window, we would want sort of a formal approval to move forward.
And then do we need to have all of those policies in place at that time of application as well? So that's going to take time to develop those as well.
Yeah, we would. I believe we do have to submit some paperwork with it. And there are a couple checklists that HUD provides that if there is a work group, we could go through those checklists and make sure we have everything in place. And a lot of it is already taken care of, to be honest. It's just sort of filling in the blanks of decision making. But again, I don't want everyone to feel like it's rushed or that we're trying to do this right away if we're not ready. So it's an option to do it at this upcoming one. But we can also say we want to work on it for a year and do it at the following competition if we're not ready. So.
Okay, can I ask a couple of my bigger picture questions I was holding off on then? So I'm kind of curious about best practice. Is this something that communities our size are utilizing elsewhere and we just aren't yet? Is it something that's kind of a new designation from HUD and so we're exploring that? I'm just kind of trying to understand the context of why now and why our community, and is this what makes this the right fit for us right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is a status that HUD introduced, I believe, as part of the Hearth Act and COC interim rule. So way back when, I don't think any were approved for several years, but at this point there are, I don't know the total number of COCs that are approved as a UFA across the country, but there's definitely more than a dozen now. And so we do have some learning we could do from those other ones, and those vary, I think, by community. I think Spokane, Long Beach, California, I know are a couple that are UFAs, but we could reach out to some of those and sort of see how it's been for them, what kind of drawbacks or challenges they've kind of come across and that sort of thing. So it's easier now, I think, that there's some learning to do from others. At the beginning, it was sort of like no one had been approved for it. But I think there are sort of a wide variety, and it really is something that HUD encourages if it makes sense for your COC. I think they've encouraged it to us a couple of times just because of the movement of funds and because we're so close to being a UFA already, in that Lane County holds the majority of our grants, which isn't true across COCs. The COCs that I worked at before, every recipient was their own recipient. And so it would mean 50 agencies would have to give up their grants to the COC, which was a much bigger shift in sort of philosophy than it would be for us.
So the other thing that I just am trying to put this like in context with is this bigger picture conversation that I know we're having that's on our strategic plan, and that is like the overall purpose of our COC and PHB and our effectiveness, and are we organized the right way? Do we have the right people at the table? Is our governance? And so I don't know how this does or doesn't impact that. I don't know if it's a chicken and the egg thing, like that would help us solve some of these problems, or if it's just really is kind of disconnected. And then similarly with the HRC, I know there's a consultant coming in to look at all of this. I just don't know if it's one of those things where we really should get through that conversation first before we make any structural changes to the way we're doing it, or if those two don't really matter if they go one before the other.
Yeah, I think it might relate sort of to the overall governance structure in that we would need to come up with decision-making authority here in terms of the UFA and the board. And so if that sort of influx of what the board wants to oversee or not oversee, it could connect to that conversation, I think. And it might be beneficial to wait and sort of see how that goes before making decisions under this current structure. That's totally up to the board. But I think overall, it just provides more, and as far as achieving our goals, it provides just that little bit of flexibility. Of course, it's still HUD flexibility. It's not like we can just make large funding decisions without HUD consult, but I think it does allow us that little bit of flexibility to move some funding around and make decisions locally versus having HUD do that, which is a much longer and frustrating process than just being able to make those decisions in the moment. Because as we know, when we make those with HUD, it doesn't go into effect until, the following year. And then it's just very delayed and you can't sort of respond quickly to the moment.
Yeah. Thanks.
Amanda, since this is requiring us to do some governance changes and other things that, such as Brittany Quick-Warner had mentioned, I know that Ms. Catherine Ryan and even Ms. Cheryl Balthrop have asked for either considerations or clarifications about what is and isn't in our charter in regards to some of our setups. And so would this be an opportunity to do some of the stuff that's been on kind of our docket since 2019 and looking at our governance and some of our next steps? Can we do that over the next 2 months with it being part of the bigger package? Because we were told to wait on some of those until we were done with our strategic plan. And then we were told to wait until after the strategic plan is done before we could do next steps. And so this kind of is like cart versus horse.
Yeah, again, I mean, I couldn't speak to that. I think I've not been involved in, in-depth conversations around that sort of governance piece or what changes you're making or not making. But I think that's up to this group of whether you feel like this is the right timing, or if you want to start at least a work group to look at it. And then if it doesn't make sense to do it in this upcoming competition, then you think about it over the next year and think about it with that governance process so that it works together. It's really up to the group.
Sorry, darn mute button. Thank you very much, Amanda. Is there any other questions regarding this process with the UFA? Mayor Venice.
Yeah, I guess I want to be clear. Are we being asked now to determine whether we want to form a work group? Did I lose track of that in the timeline?
I think what we were hoping is that, obviously the timing is coming up January to March. And so wanting to understand what other questions there are, we could bring this to the PHB. I think it's on there as a suggestion for the December meeting. Do we feel like we're ready for that? Do we feel like there's still sort of big questions out there and we're not ready to kind of bring it to the larger group? Or we could bring it to a larger group and think about that work group conversation. I think it's up to this, body of whether that's how you want to move forward or if there's more exploration you want us to do just as Lane County first.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the decision about kind of appointing a work group to look at this is a sensible decision and one that could definitely be made by the larger body at the upcoming meeting. And then they can determine how much time they really need to do a thorough job and make a recommendation back. But that feels to me like a sensible, a reasonable approach now.
Thank you, Mayor Venice. Mayor Van Gordon.
I agree. The only thing that would hold me back would be if the other folks that are involved, like St. Vinny's or Homes for Good, come back and say this is a terrible idea, we don't want to do it, right? Like this is a total bust. Yeah. Once you do that sort of basic check off, and I'm about 95% sure they're going to tell you what you think they're going to tell you, then I would be comfortable with moving forward that way.
So thank you, Mayor Van Gordon. What our recommendation to staff is to please reach out to Homes for Good and St. Vinny's to see if they support this idea. And if so, we present a request for an ad hoc work group to review this as the PHB and then solicit members.
Yes, and I guess I would say is as long as they're at least neutral to this, right? They could come back and say, hey, we still want more information, and I would be fine with that. It would be the violently opposed would be the one that I would worry about.
Yeah, and I've had initial sort of conversations, one more recently with St. Vincent de Paul specifically about this topic, and they were very excited about it, but also had some like, here's my questions and I want to think about it. And I need to schedule a follow-up with Homes for Good. I think we had a conversation a long time ago where there was some initial interest in it, but I'd like to talk with them before the next meeting and see where they're at too.
And thank you, Mayor Van Gordon, for that clarity, and Amanda for this process. Do we need to have a formal request, or does just this direction help you on this?
I think this helps me as far as next steps.
Okay. May I ask, are there any other partners that would, or maybe have not been involved in the COC process because of how we've done it before, that would be more likely to be a partner or help shore up our system by inviting into this process while we do this preliminary talk? Or is it pretty much best to go with the three that do and then just see it through?
Yeah, I don't foresee any other kind of outreach that's needed. It's really focused on the COC current structure as it is. But
okay, thank you very much. Is there any other questions before we move on to this item, to the next item? Seeing no hands, let's see here. Zooming in. My apologies. Okay, so I'd like to invite Ms. Carly Walker to talk about the 2023 point in time methodology.
Thank you. It's wild to think about 2023, but here we are. I just wanted to start by introducing myself. Some of you I know super well, and others we maybe have never chatted before. But I am Carly Walker. I work on the Wayne County Human Services Division, and I've been on the HMIS team for a little over 2 years, and I'm moving into the supervisor position. So if there's something that you worked with Lisa on, I got the amazing chance to work with her for so long, and now you'll probably come to me for those questions, or you'll be hearing from me more often. And so I don't have any handouts yet for you. We'll do a full kind of PIT conversation at the full meeting in December, and I'll have items ready for a packet and things for you to think about before that meeting. Really, the intention of today is to get 2 pieces of information from you after I've kind of explained our initial ideas for planning the PIT count. One would be, what questions should I anticipate, and sort of what items do you want to see in that packet for December? And then also some specific ideas about how we might do some of our outreach work. So just keep that in mind. First, I just want to explain a little bit about what the point in time count is. Some people are super familiar with this, and for others, it just has snuck up on us. The point in time count is something that HUD asks communities to do each year. There are actually 2 components to the count, and this is intended to be a count of all homeless individuals in the COC. The first piece is a shelter count. For us, that has always been really easy because we've had 100% participation of shelters in our HMIS. We're not quite there this year so far, but I'm hopeful that we may get there by January. The shelter count for us has always been super easy. Let's run an HMIS report. That's how many folks were in shelter that night at the count. So depending on how things go, we might need to get a little more creative this year, but shelter count will proceed as normal. The unsheltered count is where we have an opportunity to do things a little bit differently each year. The traditional unsheltered count is to do a census. So to get a lot of volunteers together and go out and survey everyone we find and ask them questions HUD has asked us to ask, and any local stuff we want to ask, and to consider that to be our count of homeless individuals for the year. This is something we have done in the past, and there are pros and cons. There are a few reasons that really we haven't done this in the last few years, and that make it hard to want to do a traditional census count. The volunteer and planning efforts are quite complicated, and also it tends to be a real drastic undercount. Very hard to find everyone on one day. So, just keep that in mind. It's also just very hard to count people in general. So I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where 100% we know exactly a number. But what we've done in the past 2 years, and that we're proposing to do again, is to do sort of a more creative sampling type methodology that results in a much better count, takes less resources, and really taps into what we have locally in our community. We differ from most COCs in how incredible our HMIS participation rate is. So not only have we had 100% bed participation in the past, but also we have so many providers who do what HUD would determine as a services only product. We have so many people who participate in our system who aren't required to, and who in other communities do not. So our food pantries, our service stations, our alternative like sheltering, safe sleep spots, conosovas, all those things, we have actually like quite an incredible data set, and really so many folks participate in our system. We get a very close to accurate count, at least of individuals who are willing to engage in some type of service. So if something's provided in the county, it is very likely to participate in HMIS. And because of that, our homeless by name list is no one will ever say perfect, but it is a very good count, and we have quite a good data set locally of who in the community is homeless. So the proposition for 2023, and I'm looking for any questions you might have that I can answer, and I'm happy to answer some questions today as well, but is to modify our homeless by name list and use that as the primary way of counting folks in the community. So the homeless by name list is something that you might have seen in a few of these calls in the past. It's a Tableau dashboard that we display quite often, and it's sort of a count of all of the individuals who are entered into HMIS who qualify as literally homeless. So whether they're in a place not meant for habitation, emergency shelter, hotel or motel that is paid for by a social service agency, anyone who counts as category 1 homeless gets included in this count. We would modify this slightly. The by name list that you see on Tableau has slightly different definitions, and we would modify it just a little bit to try to get closer to that point in time count. So rather than who's been homeless in the last month or in the last 3 months, we're looking at this one night, just like HUD asks for. But the way that we get that number is slightly different. So let me kind of walk you through that. And I promise I will have some written things for next time. In HMIS, we really have 2 types of projects. We have the type of projects where when clients are enrolled, we know they're engaged. So if someone's enrolled in rapid rehousing, I know that they're currently involved in that project. If someone's enrolled in a shelter, I know they're being sheltered by that project today. We have a second type of project that rather than that, I'm trying to think about the best way to say this, but enrollment doesn't necessarily mean engagement at that moment. These are projects like food pantries or service centers. And for those projects, rather than saying, hey, this person's enrolled, so let's count them, we would look at, has this person received a service from that project in the last 7 days prior to the count or after to count them as homeless in that situation. So for anyone who is enrolled in any HMIS project, whether it's that I'm enrolled so I'm counted, or I have a service so I'm counted, for either of those project types, if they have entered that project as literally homeless, we would include them in the count. So for our unsheltered count, that would be our primary method. Of course, not everyone participates in HMIS, or not everyone is seeking a service. So a way to supplement that primary count is a proposal to use street outreach workers on the day of the traditional pit to go out into the community in areas where we think we might be likely to find people who aren't counted in HMIS, have those outreach workers talk to them and do the traditional pit survey. That way we can include those individuals in the count on top of our HMIS count. I will say that in the past 2 years, we have had no one encountered by street outreach workers who wasn't on the homeless by name list already. That is wonderful, and also maybe we're not looking in the right spots. So one thing I would look for today is if there's any suggestions about where we should send outreach workers or partners that we might partner with to who'd be willing to do surveys of their clients so we can make sure everyone is counted. Now I'm ready for questions.
Mayor Van Gordon?
So in the supplemental answer, would those surveys be, let me see how to ask this. So if I was not already on the homeless by name list and I got surveyed, then I would incrementally be added to the homeless by name list.
Close. We would include that person in the point in time count. If they, I would imagine that as part of this process, street outreach workers would also see if that individual needs services. Do you want to engage and be enrolled in street outreach in that way? But if they don't want to be counted in HMIS, we would still like to count them in our point in time count in our reports to HUD.
Okay, so, but you would only be adding, so if you find one new person, you would be adding one new person. You wouldn't be, would you be sort of trying to statistically deduce how many people you've missed?
That's a great question. I don't think we know enough about how many people are not counted to be able to make extrapolations like that. So for this year, at least, we would just be counting one individual for the one person we found who wasn't engaged.
And what's the risk to doing it this way?
The risk to doing it this way is that, that's a great question. It is possible that we count a few people who I guess it's possible to do a slight overcount in this method. I don't see that as likely, given the amount of information that we have up to date. Really, I think this method works quite well. HUD is encouraging folks to try different creative methods rather than the traditional census, because for us, it's just been such an undercount. In the last 2 years, when we've done it this way, we've counted like an additional 1,000 people doing it this way. And I think while sampling could work, we really just have one metro area and then the kind of rural areas around. So it is a little bit of a challenge to do sampling without like a statistics person to help us with that.
I am not sure I would be comfortable doing sampling, but that's a whole other.
And that's not what we're
okay. So could you go back to this? I got about 1 million questions here, so I'm going to ask 1 questions and then let everybody else sort of jump in here.
Awesome.
So when you say we've undercount by 1,000, so when you compare, when you take, the last few years when we've checked it this way, so to me that means, and I want to make sure I get this, I'm getting my head wrapped around this right. So when I look at the point in time count that I surveyed and I add up all those people, right, I find 1,000 more people in the homeless by name tableau. Is that
correct? Yeah, and I'll have numbers for you like in a sheet for next month. 2020, our street survey, so our street census was 1,600, but our HBNL plus outreach was 2,317.
So, but who? I guess the question that I have is, who did we miss? Like, where were those folks? Like, when you look at those names, right, that's sort of fallout, right? Like, in, street outreach peoples and organizations are smart folks. They probably know who some of these folks are, right? So how did we miss them?
A variety of ways. A traditional census count, you just go outside and encounter whoever you see outside. So I think the answer is sometimes people were not visible. I heard a presentation from Seattle recently where they talked about this, and that was actually their primary issue, especially if it was rainy or foggy. They missed a ton of people just because visually it was hard to see individuals sleeping outside. That's certainly one way. Also, our county just geographically is very large, so finding enough volunteers to cover that whole geographical area in the time that we have can be really challenging.
So when we did the comparison after the fact, right, like caseworkers and people were like, oh, look, we missed Bob. Oh, of course. Oh, how did we miss Bob? Like, people had the feeling that when they did the reconciliation, like, oh yeah, the bigger list's better.
I wasn't here at that point, but what I have heard is that the pit count, just as a community, we felt was a drastic undercount of individuals and just did not match what we were seeing.
Okay. Thank you.
I think it says, Chris Ebning next. So I want to make sure I understand right. So that 1,600 was the street outreach number, and then the 2,317 was what you had in the homeless by name list. And you cross-referenced those, and not a single one of those 1,600 people weren't in that 2,317?
Sorry, let me clarify, and it really would have helped if I had sent Diana my chart in advance. But the year before we moved to the by name list, so in previous years when we just did a street count, we were getting numbers around 1,600. And when we moved to this new method, we were getting numbers in like the 2,400s and more of that category. So there's a large chunk of individuals that we just weren't picking up by doing a one-night census count, rather than leveraging all of the resources we have in the community already, which is our incredible participation rate, especially in those rural areas. And, I know in the meetings that I've been in, we talk about this a lot, how much our outreach coverage has improved in the past few years. Those street outreach projects, the vast majority of them also participate in HMIS. And so those folks are getting counted in a way that they might not have been in previous years.
So I guess my follow-up question is, I guess based on the process, you take that homeless by name list number, and then you are still going to do street outreach, and then you dedupe it to make sure there's no one who was already in the homeless by name list. Okay, so then we will essentially, in theory, see the gap in how many people, and then you add that on top of it.
Yeah, last year we did, I think it was 45 surveys, and those were individuals who outreach workers had encountered and were sort of directed to look in certain areas. And of those 45 folks, every single one was already on the by name list.
Okay, so that was the metric you were. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Actually, I have one more question. This is like not specific to the point in time count, but because I still get this question every single time I sit down with a community member, and I just feel like we don't have like an answer off the bat, is in these surveys and in the homeless by name list, because I haven't been on the back end of it, can we identify the number of individuals who are from Lane County and the number of individuals who are from somewhere else? Is that a data point that we are already collecting?
Yeah, that is a really excellent question, and it's one I get a lot also.
I figured.
The
mayor does. I'm sure you all get that question.
Yeah, there was a period of time where we had a question in HMIS that asked for the zip code of last residence. And that was a question that was implemented around the time of Hurricane Katrina to determine where Katrina victims went. So like nationwide, that's something we had for a while. What we found is that providers were never updating it, even if it had changed. And so it was really, it was not a good number to report on. The question was not worded in a way that really makes sense for us. We definitely could add a new question to HMIS if we came up with a better way to do that. I think that's something we would need to talk about as a community to decide. And I see Chris says we've been asking for modification. Yeah, we would need a new way to ask this. Another thing I would just consider thinking about is whether a quantitative measure, so a one question answer is the best way to get us our answer to that question. It might be that qualitative, sitting down with folks and asking them what exactly Chris says, where did your homelessness start? Where are you coming from? That would likely give us a much, not just the answer of are these folks from Lane County, but also what do we do about the folks that are here and what strategies have we not considered, because we just don't get that qualitative information from HMIS and from the paperwork that folks fill out when they first engage in services.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carly, for filling those questions for Vice Chair Cook-Warner, Amanda Borda, and then I will ask my question.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to add, so this is actually, we're required to do by HUD the unsheltered count every other year and the sheltered count every year. So this upcoming one is actually a non-required year, I believe. But we do traditionally do one every single year, just so we have that trending data. But I think for this count, we will still sort of request from HUD or make sure that this methodology meets our requirements. But I think it's a less lower sort of threshold to meet this year when it's a non-required reporting year versus last year. They were really wanting us to answer a lot of questions, hence why we reduced the time frame from the 30 days to I think it was 14. They said they wanted a much smaller window to look at. And then the purpose of the sort of supplemental outreach is really they want us to make sure we're absolutely covering people who would not be entered into the HMIS or who do not whatsoever engage in services. And so the intention of that street outreach is not sort of general in places that we go to normally, but it's really targeted at really those who are absolutely not engaging and really thinking about where those folks might be and really targeting that street outreach. And so again, we didn't come across anyone who was not already on the list or had not engaged in some service, but that's something to think about for this year. But we will, I believe, still be reaching out to HUD just to make sure this is okay for our methodology. The other piece that we didn't talk about is that we are a YHDP community, Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, and so we are talking within those stakeholder groups about whether there are other supplemental youth counts that we want to do, knowing that our traditional point in time count, even this methodology, using the homeless by name list, might not capture all of our homeless youth in our area because they don't always engage in programs and don't always want to provide their data, especially youth who feel like they don't trust those systems. And so we are talking still within that group about whether or not we want to do a supplemental activity that day to sort of bring those youth in and survey them, or what other strategies we might use. And I don't know, we'll bring that back to the group to sort of have a final methodology on that. We didn't end up doing anything supplemental last year, I don't believe.
Yeah, and I'll do the same request next month in December, but that's like a good reminder. Last year we surveyed 45 people. They were all on the list. That could mean one of two things. One is like, we have an amazing by name list. We have an amazing HMIS. We did great coverage. It could also mean that we didn't go to the right spots and find those folks who weren't counted. So if there are ideas about where we can direct outreach workers on that day, where to go, or if you know of providers who would be willing to, do surveys in that way, it wouldn't be a bad thing to find people who aren't on the list. That would be great to have a more full count. And so if there are suggestions about where we can direct workers, that would be awesome.
I will, I thank you, Carly. I'm going to ask my question and then allow a recycle of the queue. So then we'll have Mayor Van Gordon and Mayor Vennis. And I also like to encourage anybody here for possible public comment, please put your name and topic in the chat. My quick question, as someone who helped lead some of the Springfield point time count earlier, 2018, 2019, is that we've run into barriers where people would start a process but then stop. So whether it came to a question they didn't like, or whether or not they didn't see a point because they don't see services reflecting their situation. Is there any ways to be addressing that metric and how we're doing this?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that by having outreach workers conduct the count rather than volunteers, that's a sort of a stronger connection that we can make. Of course, folks are welcome to not answer, and that's why we're never going to get a perfect count, is because if people don't want to be counted, we're not going to make them be counted, right? There's some important survey questions that we ask as part of the PIT. I am able to pull those directly from HMIS for those individuals who are being counted that way. But that survey data is very valuable for us and helps us to know who are we not counting and who are we not capturing in HMIS. And so I'm hopeful that will be part of that.
Thank you, Carly. Mayor Van Gordon, and then Mayor Vennis.
Yeah, and this is all great information. I think when we talk about it again, just having a good template of the sort of the why and the sort of the how and the pros and the cons would be helpful. My concern also is, after how many years of doing this, as far as I remember, is that I've been on this board, right? We've changed the methodology every single year, which makes historical data a challenge, right? So again, trying to understand talking points to be able to explain to people that homelessness in the community you may not be able to sort of draw the conclusion that homelessness is, quote, getting worse, right? It may just be a different sampling methodology or something like that. And that I think would be really helpful, because if you counted had 1,000 more folks here, the automatic question everybody's going to ask is, for all this work and all this energy and all this time and money, is it getting worse? And I don't think, and that's not necessarily true, but I think we want to kind of lead with, trying to get the community to look up about 90,000 feet and say, look, the base count for the year to year changes every single year, which makes any conclusion about is this getting better or worse really hard to make.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, numbers are not everyone's forte. And it is a lot to wrap your head around, especially when you don't have all the context or you don't spend all day thinking about this like I do, right? One thing I would say is the point in time count is always going to be challenging because it's one day. And so just the idea being a snapshot. It's never going to be a perfect count, which is why we also have that by name list to supplement. And so they're both important and serve different functions in the community. I think the homeless by name list is an awesome way to get an idea of, are things getting better or worse? The PIC count is helpful in some ways. For me, one of the ways that it's helpful is to know who have we not captured in HMIS, who are we not counting in our traditional services, and sort of supplementing what we already have on the HBNL.
And that's all great, and I understand that, but there's also 300,000 people that live in this area, right? That probably have this as a number one issue that like the electeds and community members really need to help explain this to. The other piece I would, I guess, challenge the county staff with, and then I'll let my famous partner in crime here go. Is if we can figure out a way to sort of lock down, like limit changes just for a couple of years, right? I saw that Amanda dropped the thing about like we didn't change the methodology during COVID, right? So that we can just get a sense, a better sense of what's going on, or talk about what other changes we have to make, to this information gathering 3 years from now, whatever the case may be. I just want to reassure people in the community that like we're gathering good, consistent data. We know all this time and energy and work is, helping. That's what I have.
Thank you, Mayor Van Gordon. Mayor Venus.
Yeah, I actually want to thank Mayor Van Gordon for his comments. I have just two quick things. One is that that I appreciate the way you're doing this, because I think the homeless by name count gives us so much better data, more reliable data, and it feels to me that over time that's where we really want our energy to be. I mean, we have to do the point in time count to get the HUD funds, but it's actually not. We know it's not very effective, and so the less we spend time grappling with the point in time, and the more we figure out, are we getting everything that we could get out of the homeless by name count? Are we using that most effectively? Are we asking this question about, when did your homelessness begin, or however we choose to frame that, I think is going to be really important. We're definitely hearing anecdotally, about people coming into this community. So, I think it's going to help us to sort of figure out where we are. And the other thing is just, I'm sure but to say it for the group as a whole, but I'm sure that our parking teams and our public works teams are out there dealing with campsites every day, and they provide a map of where those campsites are. And so they know actually where there are sites where there's camping where people are really pretty non-compliant. So we know those people who are probably not seeking services. So I would just say, as you're structuring where you're going to do that, that street outreach part of it, to look at some of that data the city of Eugene has collected. I know it's just part of the county, but it would help.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll have a more formalized document that outlines, like, these questions were super helpful. It helps me know where to sort of direct my time and what to give you to prepare for next time. And definitely same thing next month, we'll be asking, where should we be looking to sort of supplement that HBNL count? It's very helpful.
And Carly, I'd like to meet with you at some point as one of the outreach leads in Springfield and East End County last year. So.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for this discussion. Did you get enough that you needed for right now, Carly?
I did, and I look forward to hearing more questions next month, which I'm sure there will be.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Ms. Karen Sachs on the business of the board.
Yeah, hi everyone. Karen Sachs, the new Human Services Division Manager. For those of you I haven't officially met yet, but nice to see so many familiar faces and voices and names. So I am pinch hitting for Kate since she is out this week, and wanted to talk about the plan for the December all-member meeting. A quick reminder, the plan is for that to be in person at Harris Hall. The first you'll see as Diana pulled it up, the first set of items are the votes, many of which we've chatted about today. Nominations for the chair. As Brianna said, please, if you have nominations, please send them to Kate by the 25th. Otherwise, we'll go through the rest of the votes as listed. And then we'll have the further conversation about the UFA. Thanks to Amanda for walking through all of that. If you have questions in the meantime that you want to make sure we're teed up for, please feel free to send them over to Kate and or Amanda. We can make sure we compile those. But as we heard, we'll definitely make sure that we speak to both Homes for Good and St. Vincent de Paul before that meeting. And then I also heard potentially having a discussion of an ad hoc work group. So we'll make sure those are both covered as part of that. I know that you all were able to review and saw as part of the consent agenda the October statement of financial dashboard and overall financials. We are also teeing up Lynn Oliver on our team to come in December to have a deeper dive conversation on that. If there are questions now that you have, we're happy to hear those, take those down, that will set up that conversation. But I just want to make sure that you all know that she is our expert. And so she will be coming to answer those. But I do see a question in the queue from Mayor Vinnis. I'm happy to pause and if you have some questions on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. And I realize this could be a topic for the larger meeting and the full board. I had been asking for these financials for a long time, and I'm really grateful for them because it's actually much easier for me to understand what's going on. But it also, when I look at it, it also points out what I don't understand about what's going on.
Okay.
And so, just as an example, to look at the pie chart, it looks like the county is spending 37% of funds on emergency shelter and only 9% on permanent supportive housing. And that doesn't feel like it squares with me with what the county prioritizes and the county as the seat board of Homes for Good. So it feels confusing to me.
Okay.
And then I think as this board thinks about our strategic plan and what we think is important, being able to understand what this pie chart is actually saying could help direct us in terms of, as we're saying, what is our priority role as a board? What are we recommending that the Board of Commissioners do? So I think this pie chart is both helpful and deeply misleading.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't seem to align with what we say our priorities are, and I have a feeling it just coming from the city's perspective, I'm assuming that that shelter number is high because the city of Eugene is paying into the Human Services Commission for some of those shelter services, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like it's not because the county seems to talk about their emphasis permanent supportive housing, and yet it shows up as 9% on this pie chart. So it's baffling.
Yeah. Thanks, Mayor Vinnis. I think that is absolutely fair, right? And so I think that is exactly the kind of question and the kind of deep dive that we will make sure that we're able to do with everyone in December. And it may just be that we need another layer or two of information that adds into that helps kind of round out exactly what that is. But I think it was our attempt, I think, as you pointed out, to answer some of the questions that have come up. And I think really that our hope is that it does guide that future conversation, but we want to make sure that it is not soliciting additional questions or feeling like we're off course. So completely fair. I will make sure that I chat with both Kate and Lynn in anticipation of December. Great.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Mayor Vinnis. Is there any other question? Seeing none, is there anything else you'd like to highlight before we move on to public comment, Karen?
Yes, great. Thanks so much, Chris. Just a couple quick last things. We'll also, as Carly mentioned, she'll come back and kind of provide additional information around the pit count. We'll do an update around cold weather as well as site-based PSH. So if you have additional items or questions on that, feel free to send them over to Kate or myself, and we can make sure that's included. And yes, I saw, Brittany, your comment or your question around the ensuring that the calendar invite is updated for the location. So we'll definitely reflect that as well, so everyone knows where they're headed. But with that, I will thank you all for your time and allowing me to pinch it. Great to see all of you. And Chris, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Karen. I would like to invite Richard Self to speak in the public comment. You have approximately 3 minutes, and followed up by Nancy Forrest.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to be brief as possible here, but last Saturday we had an incident in Eugene where a business owner, apparently a video was posted of a business owner dousing a homeless person with water at about 5:30 in the evening as temperatures hovered around the 40-degree mark. This person was sleeping at the time. Apparently from the video, the business owner claims that he was putting out a fire, which no one seems to see in the video that was posted. He subsequently told the homeless person that it was all her fault that she got splashed with water, and she wasn't in front of his business, by the way. And then at the end of the video, you can hear laughter as he re-enters his business. I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Mayor, but Eugene has a hate and bias crime and a protected class statute for the unhoused. And the Human Rights Commission is drafting a statement in regards to this, as no one is above the law, no matter how old or how long they've been in business. And I think I would like to encourage this body in whatever capacity it can to follow up with what the Human Rights Commission is doing in some form, so that we can show this is not, that no one is above the law, and this should not be tolerated in any form whatsoever. And I yield.
Thank you, Richard, for your comments, and I will follow up to learn more about what the HRC is doing. So, Nancy Forrest.
Hi, my name is Nancy Forrest. I'm a case manager with Carry It Forward. We do have a safe sleep site in Eugene. Recently, the city of Cottage Grove opened a 30-plus person, I don't think it's called a safe sleep site, but it is very similar. And I just wanted to alert the committee to the fact that, Cottage Grove is experiencing a very low vacancy rate. Rents there, like everywhere, have exploded. People on SSI, SSDI, or even low income are quickly being priced out of the market. And increasingly, people are calling us on our hotline or reaching out to the people that work for the city of Cottage Grove saying, my place has been condemned. I've never been homeless. I'm living in my car. And so many of these folks, newly homeless, are very vulnerable. A lot of them are senior citizens. A lot of them have disabilities, and their ability to get back into the market is very limited. Also, they don't readily qualify for the permanent supported housing or other tracks we've worked so hard to create, because they're not chronically homeless, many of them, yet they're extremely vulnerable and not at all prepared to spend the winter outside. And so I just wanted the Poverty and Homeless Board to know that Cottage Grove is no longer a potential bedroom community of Eugene and Springfield. It has really experienced a lot of the housing problems we started to see percolating up 20 years ago that we now see in full evidence of, and we're trying to build our way out of it, and we've created a lot of camps. The other thing that I think would be wonderful, I don't know if this is your purview, but the services available for substance use disorder, mental health in Cottage Grove are very limited. And that's another thing that's exacerbating the situation down there. So I wanted to put that on your radar. And it's been a real honor to be invited to Cottage Grove to help them begin to address the significant number of people. And the other thing I do want to share with you, a lot of people who are from Cottage Grove that are in the camp, they don't want to leave Cottage Grove. A lot of them have been born and raised there. They have family supports in the area. And the problem is there's just such a lack of housing there. And so they know maybe if they came up here, they could get on a list, but a lot of them, that's not a place they feel safe or secure. They want to stay home. They want to stay in their area. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Are there any other public comments? Seeing none, I would like to highlight as an Egan volunteer, winter volunteer, that the workload is increasing and that we rely heavily on volunteerism when we're doing this work. I'd like to ask for jurisdictions who support outreach, for systems that supplement outreach, or organizations that fund outreach, to please send your experts into the shelters. Please send your staff, if there are available dollars, if there's ways to access public health or emergency response dollars, please do that. Suicides are up, not only among clients, but also among underprepared, under-supported volunteers. We need to make sure that we do not hold this alone and that we see the light at the end of the tunnel. You are all game changers because you're all here trying to do something about this. But we need to not rely so much on volunteers, but let our systems show what we're doing. The Homeless by Nameless is a start. The Egan shelters, the Brooklyn shelter, the Navigation Center, the camps of all the communities. We are doing this, but we need to do it faster. Let's organize, think outside the box, and utilize our resources. Leverage your capacity. You are all appreciated. You are all heroes in my book. As long as we keep fighting, we will be able to at least keep people alive. Now let's make them thrive. So unless there's any further information, I would like to call this meeting adjourned. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.